This video is on ethnography and ethnographic methods. Ethnography is focused on describing the culture of a group of people. So we're really not concerned with the individual experience, but the collective experience of that culture or being a part of that culture. So the purpose is to draw out those shared experiences through describing cultural scenes or instances in which people of that culture are all interacting. It's important that you keep a few things in mind, though, when looking at culture. First is that culture is a system of shared beliefs, values, practices, perspectives, folk knowledge, language, norms, rituals, material objects, and artifacts that members of a group use in understanding their world and relating to others. That is a very long definition. As a person who has taught cultural anthropology many times, my TLDR definition of culture is just a system of shared learned behaviors. Whatever those behaviors happen to be, they will relate to things like shared beliefs, conventions, or statements that are held to be true or false, shared values, what is good, what is bad, what is desirable, what is undesirable. All of those shared values help you understand what's going on within a culture. There's also norms for a culture, and that's the aspect of shared learned behavior that are both written and unwritten rules for how people are supposed to behave, what is specifically appropriate in one situation and what is specifically appropriate in another situation. Ethnographers will look at both material and non-material culture. Material culture generally are things like clothing items, hair products, food items, how do people eat, what utensils do they use, those kinds of things. Whereas non-material culture will be things like kinship. Who is related to whom? How do you know if they're related? How do you know if they're not related? Behaviors, what time is considered appropriate to wake up, what time is considered appropriate to go to bed. Those are aspects of culture that don't have a material component. Ethnographers can look at macro and micro cultures, so large scale and small scale. They can also look at subcultures, cultures within a subset of a larger cultural group. So you may say that the larger culture is the culture of the United States, and you are specifically looking at the subculture of Denver. You could further subdivide it and say within Denver, you are looking at the subculture of graffiti artists. There are lots of shared learned behaviors that occur within the graffiti community or the street art community, depending on who you're talking to and which terms they prefer to use, but it can be very different than the expected behaviors for the general public. There are different types of ethnography, and they can include ethnology, ethnohistory, and autoethnography. There are others, but those are the three main ones that we're concerned with. Ethnology is really a comparison of two or more cultural groups, and that comparison is done in a holistic manner. It's not a mean comparison like in statistics with t-tests or ANOVA or correlations or anything like that. Instead, it's looking at those shared learned behaviors and comparing what is shared between two cultural groups. So you may, for instance, do an ethnology comparing North American English-speaking cultures of the US and of Canada, or some other comparison. Ethnohistory, on the other hand, looks at the cultural past of a group of people. Where did they originate? Where do they say they originated? Where do they believe they originated? Because all of those may or may not be identical in the real world. We also have autoethnography, which can be one of the most difficult of these to do well. And that's because autoethnography is similar to autobiography, where you are focused on self-examination and self-reflection. But unlike with autobiography, autoethnographies need to have the researcher bracketed out. So if you are doing an autoethnography, you're doing it of your own culture, your own experiences, You have to figure out how to separate your personal biases and your personal reflections from reflections on your cultural experience. So, what is right and wrong according to your culture or your upbringing, not according to you as an individual, which that sounds kind of hard to pull apart. It is, and that's why there are many autoethnographies that I would say fall short of the autoethnographic goal of representing the culture. Instead, they end up being more narrative inquiries rather than autoethnographies. So when collecting data in an ethnography, you need extended fieldwork. This is not a study you could do in a month. This is a study that most often takes 6 months to a year to complete, although there are exceptions. One of my professors in grad school was a anthropologist, ethnographer, who studied a culture in Papua New Guinea, in the highlands of New Guinea, and he got a grant back when getting a grant to study culture was like a thing that happened different times. But he got a grant to go to Papua New Guinea for several years. So he moved his entire family there for, I think it was 5 years total. Um, so he had much more in depth, long term observations. And part of this is the researcher becoming a participant in the culture. Sometimes they may be a non participant observer for many different reasons. It may not be safe for them to actively participate. They may have to do some kind of remote or peer observation rather than participating. But that ethnographer, when they become a participant observer, they are going through daily life right alongside everyone else, um, really trying to assimilate into the culture and experience that culture on an authentic level. Data collection and data analysis happen at the same time with ethnographies. Some people say that it's alternating because oftentimes a participant observer will participate and observe the culture during the day and write up their findings and analyze their data at night. However, that is not always the case. That is a rule of thumb, not a rule of fact, rule of force. Um, and really, the best practice with ethnography is to always be collecting and analyzing data simultaneously, because sometimes it can reveal also the researcher's ethnocentric biases, which we'll talk about in a second. When collecting ethnographic data, extensive field notes are taken and memos are written. Memos tend to be written about very specific topics. So it would be more of a kind of note to self, or here's what I'm thinking about this particular cultural event at the beginning, at the middle, at the end, and then maybe 2 days later. All of them would be short, probably 1 to 2 page memos, just focused on all of the cultural knowledge and connotations that that particular event brought. In the modern day, audio and video are extremely helpful because they maintain accuracy and let you review things at a later time. You, as an individual, can only pay attention to so much that's going on around you. If you have, I don't know, 2 different GoPros, one strapped to the front, one strapped to your back, you're able to capture pretty much 360 degrees of view, whereas your eyes do not have anywhere near that breadth, and your memory is not perfect. You may have to interpret what's going on camera or what's going on off camera that's affecting the things that are going on camera. But you, generally speaking, have a check on your recollection because eyewitness experiences are very rarely accurate. But like I mentioned, you need to be aware of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism literally means centering your own culture. So, centering your own viewpoints, your own experiences, and your own ideals of what right and wrong are. In order to combat this, the ethnographer needs to take on emic and etic perspectives. Emic, the insider view, and etic, the outsider view of the culture, of the data, of what's going on. because very rarely will the culture explain things the same way an outsider does. There can be a lot of cognitive dissonance in analyzing a culture. They may say, we do this for X reason, but an outside observer may say, well, that might be what they say, that might be what they claim, but in reality, they do it for Y reason. With ethnographies, especially because there is such a long-term investment in a community, there's the tendency for people to go native, quote unquote. Going native means to start identifying more with the cultural group that's being studied rather than one's own cultural group and cultural background. The humorous example is here. How was your trip to Portland, Mr. President? And then President Obama's, dude, it was chill. We're not doing enough on bioswales. I don't even know what that is. And bike lanes. And he's obviously decked out like a hipster. So he's gone native. He is assimilated into the culture so much that he now acts as if he is a part of that culture. The whole idea of going native really arises from historical ethnographies, ethnographies conducted in the mid 18 to early 1900s. It's not as much of a topic nowadays, but it is still a concern, and it is still a fine line for an ethnographer to walk. It is very difficult to spend a decade of one's life in a culture, living alongside people day in and day out, having children, bringing children up who speak the language, who are going to the same schools as everyone else in that culture, yet not identify as a part of that culture. So there's a tension that has to occur between being an ethnographer and assimilating into a new cultural group.